Luke 2:39 to 52. So Joseph and Mary return to Galilee to their own town of Nazareth. When they come back out of Egypt, they bypass Jerusalem because they realize that's where Herod is, or his son, Archelaus, a wicked son. So they head up to Nazareth. Now that's the northern third of Israel, called Galilee. Matthew 4, quoting Isaiah 9, calls it Galilee of the Gentiles. So it'll be important to understand, I think the text wants us to realize, that Jesus grows up in a largely Gentile area, as opposed to Jerusalem, which now brings up our story. Of course, we've had several verses about Jesus being born. We've had a story about him being about 2, and now we have 12 verses in the text talking about when he was 12 years old. It is interesting to anyone that really thinks about the life of Jesus how little is said about Jesus up to the age of 30. And in fact, the total story of Jesus in the 4 Gospels, we have record of only 52 days of his life. So it's a biography, to be sure. It wants us, these texts want us to know the historical facts of Jesus' life, but even more than that, there's a message that's coming behind that story that almost dwarfs or drowns out the simple, this, then this, then this kind of text that a biography would sound like. 241. Now Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem every year for the feast of the Passover. This is one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. By this time in Jewish history, many Jews came to Passover from Galilee and surrounding areas. Josephus talks about entire towns coming down to Jerusalem. The city swelled in size, probably from around 70,000, we think, to about 500,000. So 10 times the size. It would be like the feeling of a state fair on a very crowded day, probably. When he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom, but when the feast was over, as they were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, and for 3 days his parents cannot find him. When they do find him, they find him at the temple. Now that's a very general term. The temple has been in construction since 20 BC for about almost 30 years now, and it's going to be built over a course of some 50 years. So think of the temple as a complex, sprawling group of buildings, noisy, very confusing, I would say, to even try to find anyone, of course, in this complex set of buildings. But we have unearthed on the south side of the temple steps that lead up to what seem to have been the main entrance to the temple, the south side. And so you can stand on those steps today, and that's probably where Jesus was found. And as we read, and they all heard Jesus, or they were astonished at his understanding and his answers. And his mother said to him, "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been looking for you anxiously." So Luke tells the story, probably learned from Mary herself when Luke talked with her. And they acted much like any parent would do, not necessarily, well, maybe even frustrated, certainly anxious, but possibly even frustrated, certainly shaken. And he replied, Jesus does, "Why are you looking for me? Don't you know that I must be about my Father's house, my Father's business?" Well, that could reference, probably does reference, that Yahweh, of course, is the official owner of the temple. And he is already speaking as a 12-year-old of Yahweh, God, as his father. So that's where Luke even says his parents did not understand the remark he made to them. So that reveals 2 things. Again, think in terms of the story. Don't get ahead of ourselves yet. Luke is trying to present the story, in chronological fashion. He has the parents of Jesus who obviously know his divine origin, based on the virgin birth story and the Gabriel story and all that, but they are still struggling to understand who Jesus is. At the same time, we have Jesus, here's the 12-year-old, who does understand, at least in 12-year-old terms, who he is and how he's related to God. So does Jesus know his entire ministry ahead of him? My recommendation would be no. He is, again, thoroughly human. We have to keep that in mind. And so he's going to know what a 12-year-old could know at this point. But obviously it's beyond what most 12-year-olds know. What gave him the ability to answer and question his rabbinical teachers would be, I would say, not being zapped from above as much as just hard study and careful study and looking at Torah. thinking about the law, thinking about the traditions of his parents, and growing up, coming down to Jerusalem every now and then, and putting it all together. Again, Jesus is going to speak clearly, though, in 12-year-old terms. What Luke ends with, verse 40 and 51 and 2, he says, "The child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him. Then he went down to his parents and came to Nazareth. He was obedient to them, and Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and with the people." So Jesus will grow up in a very loving and godly home, but by all means, or by all accounts, living a very normal life, so that when he's 30, as we will next meet him, he will meet his own friends and family in Nazareth, and they will be shocked at his claim to be anything other than a normal kid, a normal 30-year-old at that point. Now, it should be mentioned, there are a lot of legends that have come into the church over time. This is a book called The Apocryphal Jesus, Legends of the Early Church, and listen to one of them. This would be the kind of thing we'd call it historical fiction, right? You take a Gone with the Wind story of Civil War Atlanta and turn it into a fictional story. Well, listen to some of this. This is just one of many stories that within about 100 years come out about Jesus. This is from the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. "When this boy Jesus was 5 years old, he was playing at the crossing of a stream, and he gathered together into pools the running water and instantly made it clean and gave his command with a single word. Having made soft clay, he molded it into 12 sparrows. And it was the Sabbath when he did these things, and there were many other children playing with him. When a certain Jew saw that Jesus was doing, or what he was doing, and playing on the Sabbath, he at once went and told his father Joseph, 'See, your child is at the stream.' And he took clay and molded 12 birds, and he profaned the Sabbath. And when Joseph came to the place, he looked and cried out to him, saying, 'Why do you do on the Sabbath things which are not lawful to do?' But Jesus clapped his hands and cried out to the sparrows and said to them, 'Be gone.' And the sparrows took flight and went away chirping." Now, what's so tempting, and I even had a friend at work, a co-worker once, that had a book like this on her desk, and she was reading it alongside her Bible, and you can see how confusing that would be to anyone who is not versed in what we'll call the canon. And here's a good place to mention, why do we have a canon of 66 books in our Bible? How did that happen? Well, it happened because over time, especially after the Bible was written, many or numerous attempts at making Jesus' life fanciful and beyond the pale of obviously normal got into the church. And so people had to decide this is true and this is false. And that's where we, over time, and it did take a generation or two, where we said no to certain books because they were clearly not correct. And then we go with the eyewitness account. Remember, Luke is claiming to have been an eyewitness. And again, I believe he gets this story, in fact, of this temple scene with Jesus at age 12 from Mary herself.